So this month, the House of Commons Justice Committee announced an inquiry into indeterminate sentences for public protection, the so-called IPP sentence. Introduced under the Criminal Justice Act 2003, the IPP sentence is in effect a form of life sentence that can be given to hundreds of different kinds of crimes, including some fairly minor crimes. It was abolished in 2012, but more than 3,000 people, as Donna mentioned earlier, continue to languish in prison on IPP sentences because the abolition was not retrospective. And there's widespread agreement that something needs to be done about this. Speaking in 2016, the former Justice Secretary Ken Clarke, who pushed through the legislation abolishing the IPP, said, quote, "It is quite absurd that there are people who might be there for the rest of their lives in theory who are serving a sentence which Parliament agreed to get rid of." And last year, the former Supreme Court Justice Lord Browne described IPP as the greatest single stain on our criminal justice system. And Lord Blunkett, the former Labour Home Secretary who actually introduced the sentence, has himself spoken of his deep regret over the sentence and has himself called for far-reaching reform. Now, Donna, Ungripp has been doing a lot of work in this area, and you also have experience in relation to family members who've been caught up in the IPP sentence. So just tell us a little bit more about IPP, the effect that it's had on the lives of those that you work with and connect with through your work.
I think the biggest thing is that there is a huge ripple effect, that the sentence doesn't just affect the person who's serving it, it affects their entire family and their children and so on and so forth. So, we have a lot of contact with families who we try and offer support with, and I think, they are obviously trying to support their loved ones either in prison or in the community, and the struggles that they have. I mean, the initial struggle is getting out of prison. As I said, there's still I think it's almost 2,000 people who are still in prison, never been released, and most of those people are over tariff now. So for some family members, it's tough for them, and it affects their own mental health, because the longer that they're unreleased, the more damage it's doing. And for some of those people in prison, they've given up complete hope of ever being released. They've had loved ones who've died while they're in prison, and they've not seen them in the community since more than 10 years ago. So we have some contact there, and then the families within the community, we're trying to encourage them to be active in pushing for change, and alongside supporting them to try and make sure that they've got access to things that they can use to support their loved ones in prison, as well as the people who have been released, because once people are released, they're under essentially a 99-year licence. Regardless of what crime they committed, they can apply to have it lifted, I think, after 10 years. I think 4 people have managed to do that. So, you're having people recalled back to prison because the licence conditions are quite strict on this. You've been recalled for very minor things often. I think, last year, I think there's 1,300 people in prison on recalls on an IPP at the moment. And I think 70% of those usually get released on their first parole hearing, which is an indicator of the fact that the recall could have been managed in the community if it was even feasible in the first place. So, for us, this inquiry has come at a really good time, and we're really encouraging families and people in prison and out of prison under IPP to try and get involved in, sending in, evidence of how it's affected them and what changes they feel would benefit and impact them. And I think the thing that I want to highlight within this is that anyone we speak to, there's never this kind of sense of, well, I should have never gone to prison. They're always very fair with their approach to this, that they say, I did something, there had to be consequences, and I accept that. But actually, they need to be, proportionate to what that crime was, and it's gone far beyond that now. And we hope that this is an indicator that change may be on the horizon.
And just picking up on a particular point you made about recalls, again, just in case some of our audience are not familiar with that term or the process. So, there are people in prison serving IPP who have never been released from prison.
Yeah.
They've just never been able to be released. Maybe their tariff hasn't expired, but more likely maybe they haven't been able to prove they're safe for release, whatever that means in this context. But I think, as you're saying, there are also people who, having been released from prison, have then been subject to what's called recall. So they've actually been returned to prison, just for some, in some cases, some fairly minor things. I'm wondering if there may be some examples that you might have of kind of how someone can actually get recalled to prison.
Being late for appointments, someone making an allegation, doesn't have to be proven, you go straight back to prison. You know, we've had people who were stuck in traffic, so they were late for an appointment. Their probation officer couldn't get a hold of them because they lived in a gated community. So these are the reasons. But the thing is that once they go back, they go straight back to prison. They have to have a parole hearing to get re-released, and this takes, I mean, the earliest I've ever heard is 6 months, and that's rare. Most people, it's more than a year. Sometimes it's 2 years, and within that time, you know, they have to still, you know, have no marks on their records, regardless if they're true or not, because obviously when they go into the parole board to get released, that could be used against them. So, you know, they're thrown back into this system where they have to go back to the parole board, they have to wait for parole hearing, they go back to the parole board, and the parole board have to agree whether they should be released back into the community or not. And when they are released, they often will go back into an approved premises. So like, we have people who've been in the community for 8 years, had a mental health crisis, got recalled, didn't commit a crime, and when they came back out, they've got a family, children, they have to go to an approved premises for 3 months. You know, so it just, you know, the recall is as much of an issue as those who have not been released, because it just perpetuates the cycle. And I think, you know, for those who are recalled, they just give up. You know, they kind of get to a point where they're like, what's the point of trying? Because their life is then taken away again.
I mean, it kind of feels a bit like, you know, as someone pointed out to me the other day, it kind of feels like a sort of, almost a form of just collective institutional cruelty, you know, and actually, you know, from Parliament, you know, through civil servants and prison officers who, you know, it's not necessarily it's not their fault that someone is in that situation, but they're all in different ways conspiring in what just seems like a really kind of cruel and inhuman set of arrangements, which lots of people agree makes no sense, but there seems no capacity really to just take the obvious step of getting rid of these things.